Hi, this is Kerry Saint with Out of the Pit reading. We're going to do something a little bit different today rather than continue my story, my personal story about forced adoption. And so I thought that we'd revisit some of the chapters, and I thought we'd do a chapter on what is former forced adoptions and a history of former forced adoptions here in Australia and the impacts of it, and a little bit of my involvement in the federal Senate inquiry that happened here in Australia. So let's do this because I kind of need a little bit of a break from telling my personal story. I don't know if people overly noticed in chapter 6 when I talked about my adopted mother and when she passed away. It did have a bit of an impact on me as I was actually reading that out to everybody because it's the first time that I've shared it. I've got a person sitting behind the camera there, and she's hearing it for the first time, let alone everyone else. And so it was quite a bit of a journey for me to share such a traumatic event in my life that had a great deal of impact for quite some years after. And for me to share it so openly, it did take a bit of emotional toll. And at this point, I'd like to thank those that have been watching my channel and have been tuning in. I love the support and the encouragement that I've had from people. And if you remember to like any of the videos, please do so, and please subscribe. So today we're just going to go down a different pathway in regards to my story, because all my lobbying work is a part of my story, and I thought just to give myself a little bit of a break and to help those that are listening understand what former forced adoptions is and how it's all connected within my story, I thought was really important. So let's start. What is former forced adoptions? Former forced adoptions is a policy and practice that happened pretty much all around the world at the same time, but I'll only focus on Australia. So from the 1950s to the 1980s, it's estimated that there are 250,000 non-Indigenous children were taken by illegal, criminal and unethical practices here in Australia for forced adoption. Now, there's been a lot of talk about why it happened, whether it was religious or social or, family dynamics, and that it was a shame to have a child out of wedlock. I will share my views on that from the way of researchers in Australia and how they view it. But I also have my own views, which I will share much more deeply down the track. So I have to skip a few years, and I have to skip a lot of my story to get to about 2007. And in 2007, I started to get back on the lobbying track because there was a lot of call to get the government to recognise what former forced adoptions is and to have a Senate inquiry and subsequent apologies and even compensation. So I was having still having at that time flashbacks about my childhood, and a lot of things were being revealed to me. And I decided to join a particular group online and become involved in lobbying. At the time, there were very few adoptees actually speaking out at all. Most of the groups were run by mothers that had had their child taken by forced adoption. And building up, there's the momentum built up for government to recognise it. I was invited on a teleconference with Canberra around the time that the government was going to apologise to the forgotten Australians. And the immigrants, the young people that came out of here after the war and were placed in institutions, and of course they were abused, and the government was ready to apologise to them. In the discussions on the teleconference with Canberra, with the federal government, they wanted to tag us on to their apology without an inquiry. And of course, consensus was that we wouldn't do that, that an apology to us needed to be separate. what I began to realise was that there was reluctance to recognise adopted people as suffering through form of forced adoptions. The predominant voice was the mothers who'd had their babies taken. There were very few adoptees that were vocal enough and would be able to tell their story to have our issues raised. So I eventually had to start my own group, and I basically called it WASH, which was White Australian Stolen Heritage. And why I did that was because I needed the Australian people and government to understand that there are a whole group of young people, babies, taken at birth and stolen that were non-Indigenous. We know about the stolen generation, but nobody knew about non-Indigenous children being stolen and taken in the same way. When I called the group WASH, I got a little bit of backlash about that because I was viewed as maybe I was a bit racist, and some people were assuming that I couldn't use the word stolen, and that was only relegated to the Aboriginal people, the stolen generation. Then I got a letter from a head Aboriginal elder who had written that the same doctors, the same nurses, the same social workers that stole their babies stole the white man's babies, and that was his exact words. And he couldn't understand why we were not being recognised like the Aboriginal people were for being taken from our family and our culture. So I was actually being supported by the Indigenous organisations and Indigenous groups and elders to call myself white and to refer to myself as being stolen. So with that in hand, I started this group WASH, and I started to lobby quite hard, and I had quite a number of adopted people join my group, and I set a group up online. And my first port of call was to take a bunch of us to the hospital to which we were born at, which was the Women's and Children's Hospital, Royal Brisbane Hospital, and had a discussion with head of obstetrics there, and he asked us to share our stories. And when we did, and we shared what had happened to us as babies and how we'd all suffered abuse, he then offered us a formal apology. That apology is the only apology so far in Australia that has ever recognised that adopted people suffered abuse at the hands of adopted parents. So that happened in 2009. And then we were lobbying, and we basically, we worked with a bunch of mums and mothers groups. And next thing, the federal government is calling for a Senate inquiry into former forced adoptions. Now, the problem with calling it former forced adoptions was for adopted people, predominantly most adopted people had no idea at the time that their mother was forced to give them up. We had been told that our mothers didn't want us, and that our mothers were young, that our mothers were 14, 15, 16 years old, and we were just given away, we weren't loved or something like that. So I'd say over 90% of adopted people at the time had no clue that their mother had been forced by illegal, criminal, unethical practices to see us relinquished and handed over to strangers. So in knowing that, in knowing my story, which I haven't got to yet about my mum, because my mum I'd been told my mum had died giving birth to me. And I don't want to do a spoiler alert, but that's not true. And I'll tell you later what I found out, and to know that I could get involved in this Senate inquiry. Anyway, there was quite a lot of difficulty in having a voice in this Senate inquiry because of the terms of reference calling it former forced adoptions. The Senate committee assumed that adoptees were never going to get involved. They thought that was only going to be about mothers, not adopted people. And I actually wrote a submission, and I was invited to sit at one of the hearings and share my perspective as an adopted person who'd been abused, and also running a support group for adopted people. at the time, most of the people that were joining my group had suffered abuse as well. So this was the first time that Australia was hearing from adoptees at the scale that they were hearing, even though we were few in number. As word got out, as the inquiry travelled around Australia, I listened to every hearing, and at the end of it, basically, the committee had decided that they were allowed adopted people informally to get up and share their story at the end of the day. So these were adoptees that through media or word of mouth or support groups had found out about this inquiry, had realised that they had missed their opportunity to write a submission, and they desperately wanted to share their story. About 90% of these adoptees that shared their story had suffered abuse at the hands of adoptive parents or had suffered severe psychological injury and trauma, and were also struggling with substance abuse and homelessness and in and out of mental health facilities. So they shared their stories openly with the committee, but none of those stories have been recorded. So we had a bit of a fight on our hands. And the sad thing about this is that there were many mothers that didn't think that adoptees had a place in their own inquiry. And this is because of the nature of forced adoption and the propaganda and the psychological impact upon the mothers to separate us, not only physically, but psychologically from them. And so there were many mothers that at the time did not believe that adoptees, I wouldn't say deserved, but they kind of felt that the inquiry was just about them. It wasn't until I wrote my submission to the inquiry that many of the mothers began to hear the truth of what adoptees had suffered. And I got calls from mothers all around Australia asking me, was I going to give evidence? Because they said that I was telling them things they'd never heard before from adopted people. And they said if they'd known half of what I was saying, that things may have worked out better with the child that they were forced to give up for adoption. So it changed the landscape in the sense of mothers having this recognition that even though as babies we have no conscious awareness basically of what was happening to us, we had suffered severe trauma at being separated. And then a majority of adopted people went off to homes where they were abused or mistreated or had greater impact and trauma through the lack of adoptive parents understanding that they had suffered trauma at separation of birth. So there's such a complex nature to adoption, and there's such a complexity in the sense of the intricate nature and how we actually have a voice, and why I believe adopted people still today are not being heard, not having their issues addressed. And this was my whole motivation on writing my book, because I believe that adopted people deserve much better than what they've been given so far. So it's now 2026. I gave evidence in 2011 or 10 was the Senate inquiry. So even though things have changed, much more needs to be changed, and hence why I'm sitting here telling my story. So let's get into it, and let's just share a little bit about former forced adoptions and what it is. So I'm going to read from the Australian Journal of Adoption, Volume 8, Number 2. Adoption is a legal and social construct that formally transfers full responsibility of a child from one family to another. Essentially, it is an act about legal ownership and certainty for assigning parental responsibility. That is one reality. The legal instrument does not and cannot erase or extinguish biology. It may be denied, but it cannot be extinguished. That is the other reality, and for the adopted person, they have to live with both realities. The social fabrication, legally enshrined, of being given a new identity and family at birth and at some point in the future, if indeed they ever told, or if they find out by chance that they have another dimension to their lives, a former identity and family that has been kept hidden. Living within this duality creates ambivalence, which, until resolved, it, if it ever can be fully resolved, becomes a standard feature of the adopted person's life. For the adopted person as a child in its mother's womb, it inherits a natural lineage of historic biology and genealogy, in addition to developing an intimate bond that is indivisible and immutable. Mothers are a source of life. They are, with our fathers, the crucible of our DNA. That is the innate reality of the adopted person. The legal instrument of adoption may deal with the social construct of ownership and responsibilities. It does not, however, offer any solution for the deeper human and ongoing psychological consequences of a child being separated from his or her mother. Parentage, genealogy of losing their natural heritage at birth. Adoption in its legal form does not deal with the human need for biological and historical connection. Infants removed from their mothers at birth begin their lives with a sudden, unexpected, and abnormal loss, a significant trauma. The resultant psychological effect is that an essential part of themselves has disappeared. They are incomplete and lacking wholeness. Their lives begin with a broken personal narrative. They suffer a psychological wound that threatens their psychological core of who they are and where they fit in the world, and an essential building block for developing a healthy self-identity, which in turn impacts on how they engage with others and with life's journey. This loss and wound has been known for decades, since first being mentioned by American psychiatrist Florence Clother in her book The Psychology of the Adopted Child, published in 1943, and formally described by fellow American psychologist and counselor Nancy Verrier in her book The Primal Wound, Understanding the Adopted Child, published 50 years earlier. If anybody can get a hold of The Primal Wound by Nancy Verrier, I'd suggest getting a hold of it if you want to understand the impact on adopted people at a greater level. Non-acknowledgement of loss and grief replaced with secrecy and lies. Within the world of closed adoption, the profound loss experienced by the adopted person is further compounded by the fact that the loss was never acknowledged nor allowed to be mourned, as it was viewed as legally, socially, morally, and ethically acceptable. Natural grieving was not allowed to unfold, with normal feelings of grief and loss having to be repressed. Instead, these feelings were replaced with secrecy and shame, where the child and adolescent had to begin a long process of adapting to a new family. And once told they were adopted, developed a complex set of psychological coping skills to attempt to fit in and find a sense of self. At the same time of having to accept and fit into their new family, they had to close off any deeper feelings about their original family, as if the latter did not exist and had no part to play in their concept of self and in forming a healthy identity. So basically, this was what was missing from the Senate inquiry. They didn't even want to accept that the separation at birth had an impact on us to start with. They thought that we had gone off and had great lives, and the Senate inquiry revealed the conclusion was that unethical, criminal, and unlawful practices had occurred against the mother and child. But at the end of the day, when it came to apologies, we had politicians going, oh, yeah, well, we really did a really terrible thing to these mothers. But gee, look, it worked out well. All these kids went to great homes. That's not what happened. And even if they did, regardless of the home that you went to, there was still a big impact. In 2012, the Australian Institute of Family Studies did a survey of, I think it was just over 1,300 respondents. It was the biggest survey ever done on adopted people. It was 823 adopted people availed themselves of this survey. What they found was that at the time of doing the survey, over 75% of the adoptee respondents were suffering from a moderate to severe mental health disorder at the time of doing the survey, even though over 50% of those respondents said that they went to a good home. That was a glaring reality, and that came after the Senate inquiry and after I had given evidence in the Senate inquiry stating that over 50% of the adopted people that I knew had suffered abuse at the hands of adoptive parents. They said that was like 1 in 5 was suffering a severe mental health disorder at the time of doing the survey. So at this point, let it be said that this is not necessarily the fault of adoptive parenting. Many adoptive people did receive security and care of a safe home and family life, which took care of one's physical and environmental needs. One's psychological and emotional needs were, however, left hanging, unspoken hurts and truths in the perpetual limbo that neither family nor society were open to explore. Secrecy and shame shut the door, and the pretense continued. Many other children were not so fortunate, enduring lives punctuated by emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, making their adopted experience a life of hell. Regardless of whether one received good or bad adoptive parenting, the inherent nature of closed adoption, characterized by the clean break theory and supported by secrets and lies, meant that whatever the quality of adoptive parenting, the prevalence of the core effects remained. Essentially, a closed adoption is a flawed system that totally misunderstands or chooses to ignore the ongoing harmful psychological effects. Raising an adopted child is more than providing a safe and secure environment. It requires more than simply love. Notwithstanding the importance of these key factors, it's parenting plus with a major difference. The culmination of the child's adoptive experience, separation at birth, the loss of mother and original family, and learning later, either as a young child or for some not until adult life, that they were adopted, and then denied the information about their first families. Forbidden to know to whom they were born despite their innate memories, subjects the adopted person to a life of psychological confusion and pain, manifests through feelings of having never been born, of not fully belonging, having no real sense of self, or living with a hole in the center of their being. Furthermore, the collective adoption trauma in the process of living their lives is frequently experienced as a deep sense of abandonment, powerlessness, disconnection, loneliness, and unreality, with associated feelings of low self-esteem, shame, helplessness, hopelessness, depression, anger, or rage. So that's just a little roundup from the Australian Journal of Adoption. That's just 2 pages. And that, this came out when I sat at the Senate inquiry and I was sharing my experience as an adopted person and that of a person who supported people who were adopted. When I sat there, I felt like they were hearing a different language, as if they weren't comprehending or believing what I was saying. I'm just Kerry. I don't have a PhD. I just have a lived experience. And so a lot of what I said was taken with a grain of salt until the Australian Institute of Family Studies report did their survey. Everything I said in that Senate inquiry was revealed through that survey and through the follow-up. And then it's come out even more in the research and studies that people have done after. But how much has changed for adopted people? That's my question. Today, they still refuse to acknowledge adoptees who are abused by their adoptive parents and have refused to offer a formal apology federally or by state. And until they do that, the support services are never, ever, ever going to meet our needs. So adopted people are going to continue to suffer until the day they die. I'm 63 and trying to find anybody that understands the trauma of forced adoption to what I experienced, and you've only heard a snippet of my story. There are other adoptees that have suffered equivalent or even worse to what I've suffered. And we know that adoption, the suicide rate for adopted people, the new research is that they are 35 times more likely to attempt suicide than non-adopted people. I want to share something that I shared within my support groups that kind of went nuts. How you might write something and then the internet picks it up and my phone was blowing up and I had no idea what I'd written would actually create such legs. And this came, so when I wrote this was in 2020, and we've covered some of my story about abuse and living with my adoptive parents, and I've somehow captured something that spoke volumes to other adopted people. And I'm going to read out what some of the people said in response to what I wrote. Now, I can't remember why I wrote this. It was something to do with rejection. And as you've heard my story, 2016, my adoptive mother did the ultimate rejection and screamed at me beside the seat that adopting me was the worst thing she'd ever done and wanted to unadopt me. So when I wrote this, it was after this fact. Now, I'm pretty certain that somebody in my support group was talking about the hurts and pains of feeling rejected constantly. And this is my response to them. For adoptees as newborn babies, we believe that we and our mothers were one. Our life force comes from her. It is not until we're about 10 months old or older that our brains realize that we are not physically connected. That's when we make small moves physically away from her. As toddlers, we begin to discover and test that separateness. So when we were taken at birth from our mothers, we thought we were going to die, literally. Many adoptees will share how they felt death stalking them all their life. Some act on it because it gets overwhelming. When they stole us from our mothers, we felt death at every breath, at every cry for her. Adoptees died inside and never recovered. The true self died as well, and within the adoptive family, another self emerged, a pretend self to take the place of the original self that died. As an adopted person, it has taken me almost a lifetime to understand this for me. This is why it's so hard for us to fit in with the adopted families and with our biological families. Our trauma is pre-verbal. We are still in trauma. We died and came back to life as someone else. If you were lucky enough to get a good adoptive home, you have some chance of believing you survived. But for other adoptees who grew up in abusive homes, we died over and over again. We are 4 times more likely to suicide than non-adopted people. We have had no way to explain how we feel, and we are still struggling to find professionals that get it. I think adoptees often become people pleasers, not for fear of rejection, but for fear of feeling like you are dying all over again. That's why we stay silent. We endure bad and abusive behaviors from others, rather than feel that terrifying pain and feeling of death again. When I read that, I think about my last chapter, and I think about how I handled my adoptive mother. And I'd say that, that rings very true for me. So I want to read some of the responses, because one of a mother actually asked, she said, could I please share this? It's so good. And I said, sure. Went to bed, woke up the next morning, and I just had countless responses to it. Let me read some of these out. Oh my gosh, so true. I felt this all my life, that death was close. I never thought I would live to be 18. Then I was surprised I was still alive at 30, and now I'm close to 50. No, I'm not suicidal. Thank you for explaining why I felt like this my whole life. When I saw that first comment, that was me. I didn't think I'd make 18, and I couldn't figure out why. I felt like death sitting on my shoulder was stalking me 24/7. Someone wrote, nailed it. Another wrote, yes. Another one wrote, these words brought me to tears. I read my life in them. I never felt I belong anywhere, struggling to get through every day as an adopted person. It has ruined me inside. Another, my mother kept me for 6 months, and I have a lot of this. Lifelong suicidal ideation, acted on in a few times because I'd rather been dead than live with my adopters. Another one, we died and came back to life as someone else. This is very profound. I cannot remember ever having happy dreams as a kid, just dreams of dying. Another, a truly beautiful portrayal of adoptees' early consciousness and emotional world. Thank you. Another, I just want to say that even growing up in a home with adopters, that it's classed as good. The feelings are exactly the same as those you described. Another, stalked by death, sums it up perfectly. Another, you just made me feel not alone. Thank you for sharing. As I went through these, I was getting goosebumps. I was sobbing by this stage, reading the responses from adoptees. I'd hit on something that, to me, no researcher, no counsellor, no professional had ever twigged onto, and I said it in a couple of paragraphs. Another one. This is exactly right, perfectly put. Another one. My adopted mother describes me as an infant. You would rock in your crib every night in your room, from wall to the middle of the room. Every morning I tried to sneak downstairs to get just one cup of coffee before you woke up. I'd say, please God, just let me have one cup. But no, every morning you woke up screaming and I'd feel so defeated. Finally, I had to put you on phenobarbital, which is a synthetic form of heroin, just so I'd have some peace. You would stiffen up and scream any time I tried to pick you up or touch you. You were a terrible baby. No, I was a terrified, dying baby. I was an adoptee, she says. Another, it is family law that I screened for 3 months straight. Another, Kerry Saint, your words resonate very much with me. Thank you. Another one, wow, you said it all right. Unfortunately, it's so true. Thanks for putting it into words. Another, so well written. Thank you for sharing. And this number 17, only another adoptee can know this kind of trauma. 18, I'm going through, I've just listed that number on. So I wish I'd known this before I gave my baby away, she says. I thought he would have such a good life, and he did, but I don't think he's happy. When I found out he was struggling, I was so confused. I remember thinking if he was going to struggle, he could have done that with me. That's from a biological mother. Another one, it's honestly not until these groups that I realised the cycle I was in or that I wasn't alone. This group has also helped me to understand feelings my daughter probably has and won't say. Another, I wish I knew this before I put my son up for adoption. Another, I noticed the quote, is this an excerpt from a book or a blog? If so, I'd really like to read more. So you can see why I kind of got a little bit inspired to keep writing. So another one, Kerry Saint, your words are so powerful and eloquent. Thank you for sharing your experiences with others. Another, it was right on the mark for adopted infants. I wonder if this is in a textbook. It should be. This is the first time I've seen it all together like this. Can I share this? Kerry Saint, your words resonate very much with me. Thank you. Am I able to share this? It captures the raw feelings that we as adoptees feel. Kerry Saint, perfectly. This is my PhD thesis. I've copied your writing, and if it's okay, I'll refer it to you in my thesis. How true, Kerry, and so very sad. And it goes on and on and on. All right, so that was a list of responses to what I'd written in my group page, and it went on for quite a while and brought me to tears and left me feeling that I desperately needed to write a book about adoptees' experiences, not just my own. So I want to continue in the essence of the fact that we had the Senate inquiry and we come to the apologies, state and federal, and I was very involved with the Queensland apology in the wording of it. And I remember going to a government building with the minister that was in charge at the time, the Department of Child Safety and Juvenile Justice. And then you walked into a big room, there's about 30 odd people, and they had their lawyers there and such. And we're sitting around the table and we're trying to come up with the wording for the Queensland apology. And for the most part, the mothers were speaking and they were talking about that they what words they wanted applied to them, and the word trauma kept coming up, and they were writing things down, and I went in prepared. I felt that I needed to try and keep my emotional state out of it. I needed to go in with a planned attack to get them to understand that adoptees deserved to be included with the mothers in the apology, in the sense that we suffered as they did, that our trauma mirrored each other, that neither of us suffered worse than the other. The trauma was bad all round, and that the recognition should be there. So what I did prior to going in was I went through the Senate committee report, and I quoted from the report rather than my own words. So as you've got lawyers there and a whole room of mothers and not many adoptees at all, and I could hear them just sort of basically having a great degree of say in the meeting, and I decided to put up my hand because I couldn't take it anymore. I figured they were going to leave adoptees out of this apology. So I put my hand up and I asked, could I read something out? And they said yes. And this is what I put in there that I said I took from their own report. Okay, so these are from submissions, and I'll just go through them because they're from individual people, and they're just a sentence from the Senate inquiry report. Babies being forced back down the birth canal to deliberately delay the birthing process as it inconvenienced doctors. Now, that sentence would have been that the mother was distressed and upset that the baby being forced down, but there was no reference to the baby. So what I did was flipped all the sentences around. So rather than the mother was upset and distressed, I put that the baby was distressed at being forced back down the birth canal to deliberately delay the birthing process. Babies being exposed to high levels of drugs to slow the birth process down. Babies being used as collateral on pain of death for forced consent. Babies being left for months in cold hospital nursery wards waiting to be adopted. Babies being placed in institutions instead of adoption. Babies not being placed for adoption but being left in hospitals for long periods, in one case 2 years. Babies being denied their mother's first touch. Babies forcibly removed using forceps. Babies being denied breast milk, important for immunity. Babies forcibly denied contact with their mothers. Babies being removed from the hospital away from the mother without consent. Babies being taken out of the state in which they were born. Babies being wrenched from mothers' arms. Medical treatment of babies without mother's consent. Medical treatment being denied to a baby, causing the death of the baby. And then we had unborn babies exposed to the stress and trauma of their mothers prior to, during, and after birth. Babies dying at birth or stillborn and not provided with proper burial resulted in being buried in unmarked graves. Babies being swapped to replace a stillborn baby. Babies left distressed and crying but not allowed to be touched, soothed, or comforted by their mothers. When I read those out, the room went dead silent and people were starting to cry. So instead of them hearing mum, 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 they were hearing baby, baby, baby. And at that point, when I read the room and I could see, you could hear a pin drop and people were getting quite emotional, I then looked at the lawyers and who was in charge, and I said, do you think you could actually put baby with the mother suffering trauma in the same sentence? And that was agreed upon in the Queensland apology. I don't know if adoptees would have been included in the Queensland apology if I'd not been prepared and sitting in that meeting, because even though we had the Senate inquiry, we had adoptees talking about their trauma and loss of identity and everything else that comes with adoption. We had the Queensland government willing to exclude us in a great deal from their apology. when I went in and had a meeting with the person that was the head of the department at the time, Children's Services, in negotiating the wording of the apology. And why I went in prepared for that was because after that meeting, we found out that they'd had 2 people in that meeting that didn't have a name tag on. It turned out that they were from the adoption privacy organisation, a pro-adoption group that had a lot of political sway, and they were taking notes in that meeting. And afterwards, everybody got very distressed and upset that they were allowed in that meeting, and I demanded a meeting with the minister at the time to voice my very unhappiness about these people being in that meeting. And it was there that I spoke with the minister and I asked her outright, were adoptees going to get an apology for being abused? And she said no. I couldn't believe it. They were going to apologise for separating us at birth. They were going to apologise for the trauma, I suppose, in the sense of what adoption impact has on us psychologically. But they refused to apologise for any abuses that occurred at the hands of adoptive parents. The same thing occurred with the federal apology. I had a meeting with Professor Naam Mushin, who was a family retired law judge. And when I walked in the room, his first question to me was, how many adoptees did I believe had suffered abuse at the hands of adoptive parents? And I said over 50%. He immediately said, I agree. But halfway through the meeting, when I asked him, were we going to get an apology for being abused, he said no. So even though in the federal apology, Julia Gillard does say in her speech that she apologised to adoptees that suffered a sexual abuse, it is not in any written apology. And there is no apology for any physical abuses. So this is why I'm sitting here today telling my story, because it's not over. We got half an apology. The Forgotten Australians, the Stolen Generation, have received adequate apologies for the abuses and traumas in which they've suffered. The Stolen Generation received apologies for being ripped brutally away from their mothers and families and culture. But unfortunately, non-Indigenous people have not received anywhere near adequately the same apologies. We have not received redress. They won't even entertain redress or compensation to adopted people. They are talking about, some states are talking about redress to mothers. They're still separating us. They're still putting us in a category that we didn't suffer abuse. So I'm hoping by sharing my story over as we move on, that the reality of the impact of forced adoption upon adopted people like myself will become well aware, to the point that perhaps change will occur. So I just want to thank everybody for listening to my story and tuning in and hearing what are some very painful accounts of my story and my trauma. There are still some aspects of my story that I will not share publicly. They're too hard for me to tell, but I don't think I need to. I think most people will get the gist of what I experienced. So I thank you for joining me. I thank you for continuing to listen to my story and listening and learning. And I hope it helps other adoptees out there. And for those that are not affected by forced adoption, I hope that helps for you, that when the next time you're sitting with an adopted person, you will begin to understand that they need not be grateful, and just sitting beside them, allowing them to speak their truth is more powerful than your whatever preconceived ideas you ever have about it. Adopted people will only speak their story when they feel safe enough to do so. And that's hopefully by sharing this story that you'll learn much and help those that are struggling with adoption, that you walk along beside them. So that's where I'm at. I want to thank you for joining me, and I hope you're enjoying the songs that are coming out. And the person sitting behind the camera actually sang the first song you heard in my book. It was called A Crime Not Known, and that will be played in this chapter. It's the first song I put together and helped create, and I've really appreciated those that have come along the journey with me to see songs of adoption, forced adoption, put together and told through the creation of music. So thank you for joining me.
As I was born, I screamed and cried. They tore me from my mother's side. She begged and cried to no avail, her baby stolen with no trail. They said that I was never hers, threatened her with unkind words. Her rights and mine were wiped away, stamped for adoption became my fate. Within the walls of screaming babes, my broken tears fell in silent pain. I died inside, I split in two, as unfocused eyes searched for you. Broken pieces and deep despair, your stolen infant was more than you could bear. Never allowed to whisper my name, forced to live a life of shame. Stolen years, a crime not known, how could they wound and hurt us so? How many lies and broken hearts, forever buried in the past. They told the world they did their best in tearing babes from mothers' breasts. It's for the best, they told themselves, while we endured their living hell. Don't tell me now to hold my tongue. Stolen babes from loving moms will be the song that will be sung, till every wrong will be undone. I tried my best to fit in, no matter what I remained the sin. Born of blood that is not kin, always knowing I'd never win. A stranger I forever remained, with the family who changed my name. My record sealed, my love ignored, the harshest sentence was enforced. I fought with all my inner might to unveil the truth they tried to hide. My anger soared with every wall, determined for each brick to fall. Finally the day had come when all the lies would be undone. But now you're old and so am I, grasping your hand before you die. Stolen years, a life not known, how could they wound and hurt us so? How many lies and broken hearts, forever buried in the past. They told the world they did their best in tearing babes from a loving breast. It's for the best, they told themselves, while we endured their living hell. Don't tell me now to hold my tongue. Stolen babes from loving moms will be the song that will Hear me now, hear my cry. My mother's tears are mixed with mine. The song I sing is in our soul. Stolen years, a crime not known.